What if the most controlled royal in Britain was at the center of the monarchy's biggest media scandal? What if the person trusted to guard Princess Anne's public image became the one who shattered it? Tonight, we uncover the leak that insiders are calling the fracture in the crown, a cache of private communications that allegedly proves a coordinated campaign to shape headlines, silence critics, and quietly steer public opinion from behind palace walls. It began quietly. No dramatic press conference. No public accusation. Just a series of encrypted files delivered to select journalists in the early hours of the morning, emails marked confidential, internal strategy memos stamped with palace insignia, draft headlines prepared days before stories ever broke. At first glance, they looked like routine public relations materials. But as reporters read deeper, a pattern emerged. This was not damage control. This was orchestration. The bombshell was not simply what the documents contained. It was who released them. The source, confirmed through digital signatures and internal verification trails, was allegedly Princess Anne's own communications director, the very architect of her public voice, a figure entrusted with safeguarding her reputation, shaping her responses, filtering her exposure. This was not a disgruntled junior staffer or a rogue outsider. This was someone who had sat in private briefings, drafted official statements, and managed relationships with some of Britain's most powerful editors. Someone who knew where every narrative thread began. For years, this individual operated in the shadows, controlling the flow of information with clinical precision. They had unprecedented access to private correspondence, strategy sessions, pre-appearance rehearsals. They didn't just respond to headlines. According to the leak, they anticipated them, built them, redirected them before they could spiral out of control. The timing could not have been more explosive. Public trust in institutions was already thinning. Questions about transparency were growing louder across Britain, and into that fragile atmosphere dropped a digital dossier suggesting that one of the monarchy's most respected figures had been protected by something far more calculated than simple professionalism. The media reaction unfolded in stages. First confusion, then cautious skepticism. Royal correspondents hesitated, aware of the gravity of the accusation. Some dismissed it as fabricated. Others quietly cross-checked the metadata. Within days, subtle confirmations began surfacing, phrases in the memos that matched past headlines word for word, timestamps that aligned too perfectly with strategic public appearances. The tone shifted. This was no longer rumor. It was a developing crisis. And through it all, the palace remained silent. No denial. No clarification. Not even a carefully worded dismissal. Just an absence where reassurance should have been. That silence roared louder than any rebuttal could have. If the documents were authentic and mounting evidence suggested they were, then the narrative surrounding Princess Anne had not simply evolved over time. It had been engineered. Every glowing profile, every conveniently timed announcement, every redirected controversy. And if this level of control existed here, the question became impossible to ignore. What else had been shaped? But to understand the scale of this alleged manipulation, we must first understand the woman whose reputation was being protected at all costs. For decades, Princess Anne has been portrayed as the monarchy's hardest working, no-nonsense royal, the steady hand untouched by scandal. While other members of the family made tabloid headlines, Anne remained the institution's quiet backbone. But what if that image wasn't entirely organic? What if it was the product of strategic narrative sculpting refined, tested, and perfected behind closed doors? From the beginning, her public identity was unmistakable. Disciplined, duty first, emotionally reserved. She was never the royal chasing applause, never the one courting popularity through grand gestures. Instead, she projected endurance, commitment, a relentless schedule of engagements delivered without theatrics. The press came to rely on that image. The public came to trust it. In an era where charisma often overshadowed consistency, Anne's reliability became her defining currency. And that consistency was powerful. While other royals endured turbulent marriages, explosive interviews, and media frenzies that threatened to fracture the monarchy's image, Princess Anne seemed immune. Headlines rarely screamed her name. Scandals did not cling to her. She stood apart, calm where others faltered, composed where others combusted. Commentators framed her as the monarchy's stabilizer, the quiet engine keeping the institution steady while storms battered the outer walls. But the leak forces us to look at that narrative differently, because stability, as it turns out, can be positioned. It can be amplified. It can be protected. Internal communications suggest that Anne's role as the monarchy's anchor was not merely acknowledged, it was strategically reinforced. When other members of the family faced controversy, her appearances were subtly elevated. Coverage of her charitable commitments was pushed forward. Profiles emphasizing her tireless work ethic were circulated to friendly outlets. Not fabricated, but emphasized, highlighted, prioritized. The absence of major controversy around her now raises a chilling question. Was it coincidence or control? Low drama is often mistaken for authenticity. But what if low drama itself can be curated? What if restraint becomes a shield, polished carefully to deflect scrutiny? The leaked memos hint at a deliberate effort to maintain a narrative of unshakable reliability. Words like consistency, discipline, and service appear repeatedly, embedded into briefing notes and media guidance. It reads less like spontaneous admiration and more like branding language. And branding, when repeated often enough, becomes belief. Over time, that belief solidified into public trust. Surveys consistently placed Anne among the most respected members of the royal family. Her approval ratings were steady, her reputation untarnished. The monarchy, battered by generational shifts and internal fractures, leaned heavily on that steadiness. She became proof that tradition could still function. That duty could still matter. But buried in the leaked correspondence are early signs of something more deliberate, subtle coordination of interview timing. Careful selection of journalists granted access, precise wording of press releases designed to reinforce her image as dependable and apolitical. It was not deception in the obvious sense. It was refinement, continuous calibration. And once you begin to see the calibration, you cannot unsee it. The portrait of Princess Anne as the untouchable royal may still hold truth. She may indeed embody discipline and service. But the leak suggests that truth was not simply allowed to stand on its own. It was managed, guarded, strategically elevated whenever necessary. Which leads to the deeper, more unsettling realization. If this carefully sustained image required such meticulous orchestration, who was conducting the orchestra? And at the center of that choreography stood one individual, the architect of messaging, now the unexpected whistleblower. They weren't just a communications official. They were the gatekeeper of information, the voice behind the voice, the unseen strategist shaping what millions believed about Princess Anne. So why would someone so deeply embedded risk everything to expose the system they helped build? The answer may lie in a crisis of conscience that insiders say had been building for years. For more than a decade, this communications director operated in the shadows with quiet authority, discreet, methodical, almost invisible to the public eye. Within palace corridors, however, their influence was unmistakable. They were the final filter before words reached the press, the architect behind tone, timing, and emphasis. When a statement was released, it carried their fingerprints. When a journalist gained access, it passed through their judgment. They did not simply relay information, they shaped it. Their rise within the royal communication structure was swift but calculated. Known for unwavering loyalty and strategic brilliance, they became indispensable. Editors trusted their calls. Broadcasters returned their messages first. A raised eyebrow from this office could cool a brewing controversy. A well-placed briefing could redirect a narrative within hours. Influence was not exercised loudly, it was applied with surgical precision. But power, even quiet power, extracts a cost. Behind the carefully controlled messaging was a growing tension. Insiders now claim there were disagreements, private, contained, but persistent, about how far narrative management should go. Where did protection end and manipulation begin? At what point did refining the truth become reshaping it? The director reportedly argued that subtle calibration was necessary in a hostile media environment. Others within the institution pushed for greater transparency, fearing long-term damage if perception ever cracked. And at the center of that debate stood Princess Anne herself. By all accounts, the director admired her deeply. They believed in her discipline, her tireless work ethic, her commitment to service. Protecting her image was not merely professional duty, it felt personal. Yet that loyalty created a moral fault line. If shielding her required strategic silences or carefully orchestrated distractions, was that still honorable? Or had the mission quietly shifted from truth to control? The pressure mounted year after year. Every public appearance requires rehearsal. Every headline demanded anticipation. The expectation was perfection not just in conduct, but in perception. A single misstep could ripple across tabloids and social feeds in seconds. So the machine grew tighter, more proactive, more defensive. And with that tightening came psychological strain. Those close to the director describe exhaustion not physical but ethical. The weight of maintaining an immaculate image in an imperfect world. The constant vigilance. The awareness that reality and narrative were not always aligned. It is one thing to protect someone from unfair attacks. It is another to quietly engineer the playing field itself. Then came what insiders now refer to only as the disagreement. Details remain murky, but leaked fragments suggest a dispute over a developing story that threatened to chip away at Anne's carefully cultivated stability. Some argue the director was instructed to escalate diversion tactics, amplify positive coverage, suppress emerging criticism, tighten relationships with sympathetic outlets. Others claim they simply refused to go further. Whatever transpired, something shifted. Encrypted transfers followed soon after. Drafts archived. Private memos copied. A decision made not in anger, but in resolve. The loyalty that once defined their career fractured under the weight of conscience. And in that fracture, the monarchy's most disciplined communications system began to unravel from within. But what exactly did these leaked documents reveal that was powerful enough to fracture that loyalty? Imagine if tomorrow's headlines weren't written in newsrooms but pre-approved inside palace offices. According to the leaked files, there was a blueprint. A detailed strategy outlining which stories to amplify, which narratives to bury, and which reporters to reward. This wasn't damage control. It was narrative architecture designed to shape perception long before the public ever formed an opinion. The documents did not scream conspiracy. They whispered precision. Inside were drafts of glowing features prepared before events had even taken place. Suggested angles emphasizing relentless duty and unwavering stability were circulated, alongside background briefings that framed Princess Anne as the monarchy's moral compass. Language was carefully chosen, not reactive but anticipatory. Headlines appeared almost fully formed, awaiting only the right moment to surface. More unsettling was the timing grid. Attached to internal calendars were coordinated charity announcements, meticulously placed against brewing controversies elsewhere in the royal orbit. When a less favorable story threatened to dominate the cycle, a high-profile engagement highlighting Anne's tireless service would suddenly take precedence. Positive press releases were not random, they were deployed with strategic foresight. The effect was subtle but powerful. Public focus shifted. Attention recalibrated. The storm moved on. And then there were the stories that never gained traction at all. Emails revealed polite but firm discouragement directed at certain investigative reporters. Not threats. Not outright censorship. Instead, access was quietly withdrawn. Invitations delayed. Interviews redirected. The message was clear without being spoken. Cooperation ensured proximity. Scrutiny created distance. Over time, patterns formed. Journalists who leaned into the approved narrative found doors opening. Those who probed too deeply discovered walls where windows once stood. A preferred list emerged in the file's names of correspondents deemed constructive or aligned. These individuals were granted exclusives, early insights, curated briefings. The relationship between palace and press became symbiotic, reward loyalty, encourage favorable tone, shape the environment gently, persistently, until the dominant narrative felt organic. But perhaps the most revealing layer was digital. Internal strategy notes detailed social media amplification plans. Coordinated posts timed with news cycles. Friendly commentators briefed in advance. Trending conversations nudged toward themes of dedication and discipline. Algorithms were not left to chance, they were studied, anticipated, and leveraged. The monarchy's traditional mystique met modern metrics, and together they formed a powerful engine of perception. Even Princess Anne's public words were part of the architecture. Messaging rehearsals were documented with surgical clarity. Key phrases repeated until they carried weight. Emotional emphasis fine-tuned to reinforce strength without vulnerability. Every appearance was an opportunity not just to serve, but to solidify narrative. Nothing chaotic. Nothing spontaneous enough to fracture the image. And then came the most controversial claim within the files: the redirection protocol. Buried in one exchange was a strategy note referencing priority shielding. When negative coverage threatened Anne's standing, resources would pivot. Alternative royal stories would receive amplification. Controversies involving less protected family members were not fabricated, but they were allowed to breathe more freely. Attention, once redirected, rarely returned. It was not an attack. It was a diversion. The brilliance of the system lay in its invisibility. No single tactic appeared outrageous. No individual email seemed damning in isolation. But together, they painted a portrait of meticulous control, an ecosystem designed not to lie outright, but to curate truth so carefully that dissent struggled to survive. For years, it worked. Princess Anne's image remained intact. Reliable, unshaken, admired. The monarchy leaned on her steadiness as proof of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Yet beneath that polished exterior, a communications machine was humming, calculating, adjusting, steering. And now, with those calculations exposed, the illusion of neutrality had fractured. If headlines were guided rather than discovered, if focus was directed rather than earned, then the public had not simply consumed news, they had absorbed design. And as the document spread quietly among journalists, one question began echoing louder than any headline: did Princess Anne know? Or was she simply the beneficiary of an overzealous communications machine? The leak doesn't directly implicate her, but it raises uncomfortable possibilities. In private briefings, were strategies discussed? Were narrative shifts approved? Or was the machinery operating autonomously, convinced it was protecting the crown? To answer that question, we must step into the hierarchy of royal communications, a structure designed as much for insulation as for efficiency. Officially, the communications director reports upward through layers of senior aides before sensitive strategies ever approach the royal principal. The system is deliberate. It creates distance. Plausible deniability is not an accident within institutions built on tradition. It is architecture. And yet, the leaked memos complicate that distance. Phrases such as Her Royal Highness, comfortable with tone and approved emphasis appear repeatedly in briefing notes. The wording is careful, vague enough to protect, specific enough to imply awareness. But awareness of what, exactly? Tone approval can mean anything from adjusting language for clarity to endorsing a broader narrative shift. The ambiguity feels intentional, as though designed to blur the line between consultation and command. History offers precedent. Monarchs and senior royals have long relied on advisors to navigate public perception while remaining personally removed from tactical details. The crown endures partly because it floats above the machinery beneath it. Strategy is executed in offices, royalty stands above the fray. That separation is both shield and sword. But insiders whisper a more nuanced reality. According to sources familiar with internal briefings, Princess Anne was not disengaged. She was known to be meticulous, detail-oriented, invested in how her work was portrayed. While she may not have drafted strategies herself, she reportedly reviewed summaries, asked pointed questions, and insisted on consistency in messaging. That does not confirm orchestration. It does, however, challenge the idea of total detachment. Here lies the moral gray zone. There is a profound difference between passive awareness and active direction. Knowing that your team is positioning you as the embodiment of stability is not the same as instructing them to redirect scrutiny toward others. But when repeated patterns of narrative shielding emerge, when controversial stories fade as positive coverage rises, the distinction begins to feel fragile. Within palace walls, opinion appears divided. Some staff insist Anne trusted her communications team implicitly and rarely interfered beyond approving public statements. Others suggest she understood precisely how the system functioned and believed it necessary to protect the monarchy's reputation during turbulent times. Neither portrait fully absolves nor condemns. Both live in tension. Meanwhile, public perception has begun to shift. For decades, admiration for Anne rested on the belief that she was untouched by palace gamesmanship. She represented duty without drama, integrity without spectacle. But the leak has introduced doubt into that certainty. Social discourse has grown sharper. Commentators who once praised her stoicism now question whether it was curated. The difference between authenticity and management is thin, and once questioned, it cannot be easily restored. If she knew, critics argue, then silence becomes complicity. If she didn't, supporters counter, then she too was navigating a system larger than herself. The monarchy has always thrived on mystique, yet mystique becomes vulnerability when transparency is demanded. And as debates intensified and loyalties fractured, a darker revelation surfaced within the files, one that suggested this was not merely about image control, but about calculated sacrifice. Yet as speculation grew, something even more unsettling emerged from the leak. What if protecting one royal meant exposing another? Buried within the documents was a strategy some are calling sacrificial optics, a calculated diversion designed to redirect media firestorms away from Princess Anne during sensitive moments. The implications were staggering. The monarchy not as a united front, but as a battlefield of controlled narratives and silent trade-offs. The language in the files was subtle, almost clinical. Phrases like priority shielding and narrative redistribution appeared in internal exchanges, often attached to calendar dates that coincided with rising scrutiny elsewhere in the family. When pressure began to mount around Princess Anne, whispers of criticism, questions gaining traction, the cycle would shift. Within days, sometimes hours, a different royal controversy would surge to the surface. It was never presented as fabrication. That is what makes it so chilling. The stories amplified were real, but their timing felt engineered. Headlines that might have simmered quietly suddenly dominated the front pages. Commentary panels redirected their focus. The spotlight pivoted. And in that pivot, Anne's name receded into the background, steady and untouched once more. The documents suggest this was not coincidence. They reveal internal discussions about leveraging existing vulnerabilities within the broader royal landscape. In plain terms, if another family member was already under scrutiny, that scrutiny could be intensified, nudged forward, allowed to expand, creating space for Anne's image to remain undisturbed. It was not war in the traditional sense. It was strategy. Some correspondence hints at quiet coordination with influential tabloid editors. Not overt instruction, but strategic briefings. Additional context available if useful. One message reads, "Opportunity for deeper exploration," says another. The tone is polite, professional, but the effect is unmistakable. Stories were not suppressed outright. They were rearranged. And behind every rearrangement lies an ethical fault line. Selective protection may preserve institutional stability, but it comes at a cost. If one royal is shielded while another absorbs the impact of public outrage, unity becomes performance rather than principle. The monarchy has long presented itself as a family bound by duty, resilience, and shared sacrifice. But these documents paint a more complicated portrait, one where sacrifice may not have been shared equally. Imagine the emotional strain behind closed doors. The knowledge that your missteps, real or exaggerated, are allowed to dominate headlines while another's are carefully softened. Resentment does not need to be loud to be powerful. Rivalries do not require open conflict to fester. In a family already navigating generational tension and public scrutiny, perception control becomes gasoline on an existing fire. Insiders now suggest that trust within certain circles quietly eroded over time. Not because of overt betrayal, but because of imbalance. If Princess Anne was deemed the institution's stabilizer, then stabilizing her image became paramount. Others, by comparison, became expendable in the calculus of survival. Publicly, they stood shoulder to shoulder at official events, projecting unity. Privately, according to the leaked correspondence, optics were weighed like currency. This is where the narrative shifts from strategy to consequence. Because once the public begins to suspect that stories were not merely reported but redirected, admiration turns into skepticism. Loyalty becomes fragile. The monarchy's greatest strength has always been the illusion of cohesion, a single family weathering storms together. But sacrificial optics suggests a quieter reality, storms sometimes redirected, lightning occasionally allowed to strike specific targets. If true, The implications are explosive. Not just for Princess Anne, but for every royal whose reputation rose or fell during those carefully managed cycles. It reframes past controversies. It casts new shadows over old headlines. It forces the public to reconsider moments they once accepted at face value. And as these revelations spread beyond journalistic circles and into the national conversation, the institution itself began to feel the tremors. But the leak did more than expose manipulation, it ignited a crisis within the institution itself. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings were reportedly held, advisors scrambling, lawyers reviewing every line. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, and scandals, but this was different. This wasn't an external attack, it was internal exposure. And insiders say the atmosphere inside palace walls shifted from controlled calm to quiet panic overnight. The first priority was containment. Within hours of the leak circulating among major newsrooms, senior aides were summoned. Digital security teams combed through servers. Access logs were scrutinized. Who knew? Who had copied what? The betrayal cut deeper than any tabloid scandal because it originated from inside the trusted circle. This was not rumor fed by rivals or gossip from outsiders. It was documentation. Structured, detailed, dangerous. Legal advisors immediately began drafting responses, not public statements, but protective frameworks. Cease and desist warnings were quietly prepared. Confidentiality agreements were reviewed for weaknesses. The palace faced a delicate balance. Pursue aggressive legal action and risk validating the leak's authenticity, or remain measured and risk appearing complicit through silence. Every move carried consequence, and silence, in the end, became the chosen strategy. No fiery denials, no outraged rebuttals, just composed restraint. Publicly, the monarchy continued as scheduled. Engagements proceeded. Statements remained focused on service and continuity. The message was subtle but firm. The institution would not be destabilized by internal turbulence. Yet that silence spoke volumes. It left a vacuum that speculation eagerly filled. Inside the palace, however, loyalty was no longer assumed, it was tested. Staff were reminded of confidentiality obligations. Private conversations grew cautious. Alliances that once felt unshakable now seemed fragile. Who sympathized with the communications director? Who feared additional revelations? Trust, once implicit, required reaffirmation. The psychological weight of suspicion settled quietly over corridors that had long relied on discretion as currency. Meanwhile, news outlets moved carefully. Editors did not rush to publish every claim. They cross-checked metadata, verified timestamps, compared leaked phrasing to past official releases. And as confirmations trickled in, the tone of coverage shifted from curiosity to gravity. This was no longer speculative drama. It was a structural rupture. Social media fractured almost instantly. Some defended Princess Anne fiercely, arguing that narrative management is standard practice in modern institutions. Others expressed anger, feeling manipulated by a system they believed was above political gamesmanship. Hashtags trended, comment threads exploded. Admirers questioned their trust. Critics sharpened their accusations. The monarchy's carefully cultivated aura of steady permanence suddenly felt vulnerable to digital volatility. But beneath the visible chaos lay an even darker anxiety. Insiders began whispering about the possibility of additional files, documents not yet released. The leak, according to those familiar with its origins, represented only a portion of the communications director's archive. If true, then the palace was not facing a singular storm but a potential series of detonations. Each unreleased memo became a ticking clock. Each unanswered question became a source of dread. This fear altered strategy. Public composure masked private contingency planning. Crisis teams mapped scenarios. What if further coordination with tabloids was revealed? What if internal disagreements became public transcripts? What if other royals were named explicitly? The stakes were no longer confined to Princess Anne's reputation. The institution itself stood exposed, and as days passed without a definitive resolution, one reality became impossible to ignore. The monarchy's strength has always rested on perception of the belief that beneath tradition lies unity and integrity. Now that perception was under siege from within, and as the institution tried to regain control, the public began asking a deeper question: For years, the monarchy has promised modernization and transparency. But what does transparency truly mean when narratives are carefully filtered? The leak forces a reckoning not just for Princess Anne, but for the institution itself. Is reputation management simply smart governance? Or does it cross into manipulation when public perception becomes a product engineered behind palace gates? The modern monarchy does not survive on tradition alone. It survives on optics. In an age where every institution is scrutinized in real time, image is no longer ornamental, it is structural. Public appearances, charitable patronages, carefully worded statements, all of it feeds a narrative ecosystem that determines relevance. Without favorable perception, even centuries of legacy begin to feel fragile. This is not unique to royalty. Corporations do it. Governments do it. But the monarchy occupies a different moral space. It does not campaign for office. It does not compete in markets. It stands as a symbol of continuity, of national identity, of stability. That symbolism relies on trust, and trust, once questioned, rarely returns unchanged. The leak exposes a thin line between public relations and propaganda. Public relations clarifies truth. Propaganda reshapes it. One informs, the other influences. The leaked strategy documents suggest that influence may have crept closer to the core than the public ever realized. Not lies, but calibration. Not invention, but emphasis. Yet even emphasis, when deployed strategically, can tilt reality. History offers sobering reminders that narrative control has always existed within powerful institutions. Monarchies have commissioned portraits, sanctioned official biographies, cultivated alliances with friendly publishers. Control of story has long been intertwined with control of legacy, but never before has that process been laid bare in digital correspondence, time-stamped and searchable. The difference now is visibility. Public trust has become the monarchy's most fragile currency. In a world where citizens demand transparency from every governing body, the expectation of openness has expanded. Younger generations, raised in an era of whistleblowers and social accountability, are less inclined to accept mystique as justification. For them, authenticity matters more than ceremony. Perception management feels suspicious, not strategic. This generational divide deepens the crisis. Older supporters may view narrative shaping as necessary protection in a ruthless media climate. Younger critics see manipulation where others see professionalism. The same documents provoke entirely different emotional responses. And within that division lies a quiet but profound threat, a fractured audience. The ethical dilemma is painfully complex. Protecting the institution may feel like protecting national stability. Advisors likely believed they were defending continuity, not distorting reality. In times of turbulence, preserving calm can seem like a duty. Yet if preservation requires selective amplification and redirected scrutiny, the moral clarity dissolves. Princess Anne's image, disciplined, steady, resilient, now sits at the center of that ethical storm. Was it safeguarded because it deserved protection, or because it was too valuable to risk? The answer may not be binary. It may exist in uncomfortable shades of gray. But gray areas rarely satisfy a public hungry for clear lines. The long-term implications stretch far beyond one royal or one communications office. If perception can be engineered so seamlessly, what does that mean for the institution's claim to moral authority? Legitimacy does not rest solely on law or lineage. It rests on belief, and belief depends on authenticity. Once authenticity is questioned, even subtly, the ground shifts. The monarchy has weathered countless crises across generations, emerging intact each time. But this moment feels different. It is not scandal-driven by personal missteps. It is structural. It challenges the mechanics behind the image itself, and when mechanics are exposed, mystique loses its shield. The leak has not toppled the crown, but it has cracked the illusion that narrative and reality were always aligned. And in that crack, doubt seeps quietly, persistently. And yet, the most chilling question still lingers: what happens next? Leaks fade. Headlines move on. But reputations linger in the shadows of doubt. As Britain watches closely, Princess Anne faces perhaps the most defining chapter of her public life. Will she confront the allegations? Will the communications director speak openly? Or will this become another carefully managed moment in royal history, absorbed quietly into the crown's long memory. The palace now stands at a crossroads. One path leads to confrontation, a carefully crafted but direct public statement from Princess Anne herself. Not a generic press release, not a spokesperson's deflection. A personal address acknowledging the communication strategy, reframing it as necessary stewardship in an unforgiving media landscape. Such a move would be bold, risky. It would humanize her, but it would also confirm that something needed explaining. The other path is silence reinforced by time. Historically, the monarchy has relied on endurance. Weather the storm. Let public attention drift. Continue the work. Eventually, new headlines replace old controversies. This strategy has preserved the crown through crises far more explosive than this. But today's media environment is different. Digital archives do not forget. Screenshots do not fade. Silence no longer guarantees erasure, and hovering over every calculation is the threat of further exposure. The communications director has not spoken publicly. Not yet. But insiders suggest the released documents may represent only a fraction of what exists. If additional files surface explicit references, undeniable coordination, the situation could escalate beyond reputation management into existential scrutiny. The palace must prepare not only for what has been revealed, but for what may still be concealed. In response, image recalibration has already begun. Subtle shifts in tone, increased visibility in unscripted settings, carefully chosen interviews emphasizing authenticity over polish. The messaging has softened, almost imperceptibly. The rigid architecture exposed by the leak is being replaced with something more flexible, more human. Whether this reflects genuine transformation or simply a more advanced layer of strategy remains uncertain. What is certain is the monarchy's survival instinct. For centuries, it has adapted without appearing to change. It has absorbed scandal, redefined roles, modernized rituals. It knows how to bend without breaking. But adaptation requires understanding the moment, and this moment demands transparency in a way previous eras did not. The public appetite for clarity has grown sharper. Citizens want not just ceremony, but sincerity. Princess Anne's legacy now hangs in delicate balance. For decades, she has embodied steadiness in an institution often criticized for excess and drama. That steadiness earned admiration, respect, trust. The leak has not erased her record of service, but it has introduced complexity into a once uncomplicated narrative. Her legacy will not be defined solely by what was done behind closed doors, but by how she responds when those doors are forced open. If she chooses confrontation, she risks vulnerability. If she chooses silence, she risks suspicion. Neither path is safe, both demand courage. And beyond her personal reputation lies a broader question about the monarchy's future. Can an institution built on mystique thrive in an era that demands radical openness? Can strategic communication coexist with genuine transparency? Or has the line been crossed too many times to return unquestioned? The public is watching. Staff within palace walls are watching. Even those once fiercely loyal are watching. Because this is no longer just about leaked emails or manipulated headlines. It is about trust, whether it can be rebuilt, whether it was ever as solid as it appeared. And as the dust settles, one haunting possibility remains. Is this the end of narrative manipulation within the monarchy or merely the first crack in a far deeper foundation? Because in a monarchy built on tradition, power often lies not in what is said, but in what is strategically revealed and what is forever kept hidden.